Prince Harry and his wife Meghan have arrived today in Australia for the Invictus Games. Invictus is Latin and it means undefeatable. This is so prophetic for me, sitting down on this very day to write this video about our marriage. The Invictus Games is for people who have been severely injured and have been taken out as a result of war and battles. But these games prove that the injured are not down and out of the game, but can again rise despite their injuries and overcome. They become undefeatable. My husband Danny spoke in the last video about how God restored him so that our marriage would function like God designed it to. But of course, there is also my side of the testimony. The thing is, as I've said before, if we want our calling to be everything God has designed it to be, we have to be in a healthy relationship with each other. We are called to be one spirit, not two separate people doing our own thing and maybe coming together for the odd thing. We are one, and if we ignore what God has placed in our partner, then we ignore half of who we are. I've also said that Danny and I are not great and powerful prophets. God didn't raise us up and train us to be great prophets. I believe He has done what He has done in us to show people the journey. God is a God of restoration, and nothing is too sinful or too broken that He cannot fix and use, if we let Him do that. And we, Danny and I, are evidence of that. Danny was a passive-aggressive abuser and I was a terminal victim. I played the martyr perfectly. We were married, but we were two separate people sharing the same space. There wasn't unity. There wasn't safety in each other. We were in a constant battle with each other. Instead of being strong together, we were always in a weakened state. We were no witness for God. God calls us for a reason. He doesn't call us so we can be saved and get to go to heaven while the people around us go to hell. We are called to be witnesses of Him, to display the redemptive power of God through our lives. Straight after I got saved, I started praying for Danny. I cried, I interceded, I nagged, I pointed out things in the Bible to him. Then very early on, God said to me, "You just concentrate on yourself, I'll take care of Danny." So that's exactly what I did. For 15 years, I worked on myself, allowing God to transform me. It was an extremely painful process. But there was a payoff. I was giving myself a better life. I had lived for so long in a permanent fog. I was always depressed. I couldn't laugh. Life wasn't fun. It was something I survived. But it was slowly changing. It was becoming better, except for my marriage. Danny got saved about a year after me, but there was no real change in him. And we started to clash more and more because I was operating differently now. I was starting to walk in my freedom, and he was fighting for me to remain the same victim martyr. It got to a breaking point because Danny wasn't changing. After God had promised me He would take care of Danny, but Danny just didn't appear to even like me, let alone love me. He wouldn't protect me. He did the opposite. He would often throw me to the wolves, especially if it meant taking the heat off him. The night we had our last argument, I had been so angry at him because I had a woman who was stalking me. It was a very spiritual thing. She was part of a cult religion. She was also part of our community of friends. And she latched on to me and started dressing like me, cut her hair like me, was following me, would listen in to all my private conversations I had with others. And I was asking Danny to support me, to help me break free. I begged him to help me find the answer because it had become such a nightmare to live with. Danny kept blaming me. He said it was my fault and he did nothing at all. I felt alone, unprotected, unsupported, unloved, and very afraid because I knew the only answer was to withdraw from our group of friends. And that would leave me nothing because I didn't even have a friend in my marriage. This particular night we went to a birthday party. This stalking woman had promised me to my face that she would not be attending. But about an hour after it started, she walked in. And I knew that she'd lied to me in order to put me off guard. She had a Jezebel spirit, and this was part of my learning about Jezebel. When she walked in, I burst out crying, and I asked Danny to protect me, but he just went off to enjoy himself with others on the dance floor. I left and went outside because I couldn't cope anymore. I was at absolute breaking point. This had gone on for nearly 2 years. Danny came out to talk to me and I told him I needed to go home. I knew it was the end for me. I was just about to lose all my friends. Danny said he would go back in and get our stuff and then we would go home. While he was in there, the birthday girl came out and said to me, "You're so lucky. You have a husband who protects you." And that was it. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. Because Danny was living a lie. He painted this picture for everyone else that he was Prince Charming on the horse coming to rescue me. But in truth, he treated me like dirt. And because of that, I was now going to lose all my friends. And I had this aha moment that nothing was ever going to make him love me and protect me. He was never going to change. And I just couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't be the reason for everything wrong in his life anymore. I told him that night when we got home that I was going to leave. I had been seeking God day and night about this and what was going wrong and what should I do. And all I got was mixed messages. God never said leave, but neither did he say stay. And I had stayed till I just couldn't stay any longer. When I left, I believed sincerely with all my heart that the marriage was over. I registered with the government that the marriage was legally separated and I prepared for divorce. I went to a lawyer and I went to legal aid to apply for divorce. We'd been living separately in the house for about 2 years, but this hadn't encouraged Danny to change. But when I went to seek a divorce, they told me that I had to be living out of the house, physically separated from Danny for 1 year before I could apply for a divorce. So I filled in the paperwork and I waited for the year to go by. It was a terrible year. I'd lost my marriage, my son, all my friends, my home, my security, and I had no family to support me. I was totally alone. I had to go to work, which wasn't an issue as such because I'm a good worker. But going through the process, because it'd been so long that I'd been out of the workforce and nobody wanted to employ me and I had no money. But after a few months, I eventually got a retail job. There wasn't any weekly money left over because I had to work as a casual. So I couldn't go out anywhere, but I was used to that. That was normal for me. The isolation was so excruciating. I went for a walk one Saturday and I passed a house and all the family was in there. The mums, the dads, the aunts, the uncles, the brothers and sisters and cousins, and all laughing and having a party together. And I went home and tried to commit suicide that night. I filled the bath, I got in fully clothed, and I was going to drop the hairdryer in the bath. I knew I might not be found for weeks, probably until the rent became really overdue or something. But in the end, I didn't do it because I was so scared it wouldn't work and I might end up a vegetable instead and get stuck in that state for the rest of my life with no way out. So I got back out of the bath dripping wet and cleaned up the mess. A few months after this, I started to date a man. It was out of loneliness. I knew from the beginning he wasn't a nice person, but I kept kidding myself because at least there was someone to talk to. It didn't last long because he was a destroyer and he was just making life worse, not better. When a year went by, I decided to go back home because the rent was going up and I couldn't afford it. I thought I might as well be unhappy back at home as unhappy anywhere else, and Danny at least could afford to pay most of the bills. So I moved back into my own room again. I had no intention of getting back with Danny, but over time I discovered he had truly changed. I didn't believe it for a long time, but slowly I saw the evidence. Whilst I had been living away, he'd been going to a counsellor who had in turn sent him to a group anger management course. And this had been very confronting for him and caused great miraculous change in him. That was 12 years ago now, and he has not reverted back to his old unredeemed self. What God did truly changed him. He became so loving and thoughtful and supportive, and our spirits eventually became one spirit. But it was a process of pulling all the walls down that were built up between us over all the years caused by pain and rejection. But something very significant happened that pulled the last wall down. In 2012, which was about 5 years after we got back together, I found myself in a position where I was driving a lady to the airport as a favour for someone. This lady, her name was Helen, was a prophetess and had been speaking at the local church where my mum attended. I picked her up and I drove her to the airport. Along the way she spoke about herself and basically I just listened and murmured in agreement. But just before we reached the airport, she asked me to pull over. She had a word from God for me, so I did. She knew all this stuff about Danny and I, about our marriage, about what had happened, and then she said, God wants you to renew your vows, that it was very important that we did this. So that's what we did. We didn't rush to do it. We hadn't been in church for 14 years. We didn't really know any pastors well enough to ask them to do this. But we prayed about it and God led us to someone. In the meantime, I started to study God's word about marriage. Danny already knew I had dated someone. I never hid that from him. He knew at the time, and I had already asked God for forgiveness for adultery. Even though the marriage was over for me at that time, I wasn't going to quibble about semantics. I accepted it as adultery and confessed it as such. And I discussed this with Danny on more than one occasion. I took responsibility for what I had done. But Danny did also, because he believed that if he had done the right thing by me in the first place, then I wouldn't have found myself in that position. That didn't excuse me, though. Part of our vows was going to be formally forgiving each other for all the ways in which we had each let each other down, and not just assuming that we'd already done this. It needed to be done before God. But the big thing that God really confronted me about was, and it was something I wasn't really aware of, is that I was the one that had broken covenant in the marriage. I was the one that had moved out. Not that that means you're breaking covenant, but I had considered the marriage over. I broke the covenant that we had made before God. The whole thing was very, very confronting to have to look at what I was capable of. I'd always seen myself as the victim, but I was so capable of sin when push came to shove. It was especially uncomfortable having to do this all in front of the pastor and his wife, because he wasn't a very wise man, and he later publicly put us down over this. But that's his shame, because he publicly patted himself on the back for what God had actually done in us. What we did was extremely brave. I'm very proud of us for the humility we showed, and I'm so grateful that God did what he said he was going to do. The last walls came tumbling down that day, and there is no shame between us anymore. There is no accusing one another or finger pointing, no pain or hurt or distance between us. Neither is there a battle between us anymore. We have such a joy in our relationship. I lose count some days of the ways in which Danny expresses his love for me, both verbally and in action. It has also been since renewing our vows that God has been working through us in a much more fruitful way. The amount of revelation he has released to us since then grew exponentially, and it's been done together. Before that, there was nothing much worth talking about. Danny was over there being an elder or whatever, a role that I was never included in, and I was over here doing whatever I was doing, each of us doing our own thing. I started out believing God could do anything, especially what his word said he could do. But then as the years went by and it didn't happen, I lost that faith and thought it was never going to happen. God couldn't or wouldn't do it, and I gave up. But thank God he didn't. It cost me so much to see it come to fruition. It was truly horrible to go through, but I don't believe there could have been an easier way. It was what it was because of who we were. But that's behind now, and all I have with Danny is far more than I thought anyone could possibly have in a marriage. It's not just a good marriage, it's a powerful marriage. The power of God's redemption is extremely evident in it. Maybe other people don't see it. Maybe they only see the sins. But the angels see the overcoming victory. And you know what? Even more importantly, the demons do. And in God's kingdom, we are not down and out of the game, but we are winning the Invictus games. We are undefeatable.